That was so bad. Alamance, this is your last week, but y'all really, you made it and you ended up with a winner on your side in this tournament. So shout out to y'all. Um, if we could spotlight our speaker too. I want to welcome our speaker today, Alexandra Sirota. She is the executive director at the North Carolina Budget Tax Center. And I've gotten the pleasure to meet her and learn a lot more about the Budget and Tax Center through a fellowship I was a part of with them called the Better and See Fellowship. She's going to be sharing a lot of juicy info today, and I'm excited for all the learning. If you have knowledge on the budget process, I encourage you to share and ask great questions in the chat, help others understand throughout. But I'll pass it to you, Alexandra, to introduce yourself and get us started on the workshop.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with you all. My name is Alexandra Sirota. I'm the Executive Director at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. I've been working on budget issues for more than 14 years, and I really came to this work because I see the state budget as a powerful tool in advancing equity and opportunity in all of our communities across the state. It's really the biggest policy decision that gets made every year. And it's our dollars ultimately that get allocated across different priorities and communities. So really excited to be with you all, hear from you about the priorities you have for our public money, and share a little bit about how you can engage in the process as you move forward. I did put together some slides, so I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And I really do encourage interaction and, engagement. I will say that I am a little bit technically challenged. So if I don't see your notes in the chat, just maybe wave and I'll try and do.
We'll definitely be looking at the chat for you, so we'll
great.
highlight anything that needs to be asked or shared.
Great. So I'll jump in. As I said, our organization works on the state budget, and we really see our public dollars as a key tool in advancing the future we want to see. Today, I wanted to talk about why budgets matter, go deep on the state budget process, and have a conversation about how budget decisions connect with community. So some of the goals that I think we hope to achieve in sharing this information is that you have information to connect outcomes in your community, the outcomes you want to see, the outcomes you're not seeing, with state budget choices that could be made to make lives better. I hope that you'll leave with some ways to engage in the state budget process and have connected specifically state budget decisions to education priorities you have. So I want to kick it off with just an interactive thing, and you can share in the chat if you've or raise your hand. How many folks have visited a state park this year? How many folks drove on a road today or took public transportation? How many folks drank or used water from the tap? How many folks dropped kids off at school or childcare center? So all of these things in our daily lives are supported by public dollars, and we all have connections to them, but they're often unseen. We don't think of them as the way our public money is at work in our communities, but we really touch budget decisions every day. And so part of the work we see at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center for our organization is to help lift those up and make them more clear as decisions that our policymakers are making, and oftentimes, unfortunately, not with an understanding of how it plays out in our communities. We know that if we make the budget decisions that reflect people's priorities, that we can have thriving families, we can have communities of opportunity, and we can fully live in to the multiracial democracy that we know we need in our state. We see our work at the Budget and Tax Center to build a better budget as focusing on 3 key levers. One, centering what people across the state need. And that means connecting with you all to understand what you're hearing about people's priorities. It means connecting with other networks across the state to understand what the issues, challenges, opportunities are. We also think it's critical that we build a value and talk about the value of public funding and public systems. So often government is made out to be bad across the board, but we know that there can be positive impacts when government takes action with communities' input in mind and at the center. And then the third thing we think about when we think about building a better budget is stopping the tax cuts that have gone to the richest few and wealthy corporations in North Carolina. This is a critical tool to make sure that our state has the public money that we need over time to keep up with the needs in our communities. So I think, a lot of times when we're talking about budgets, we're talking about public budgets at every level, and it can get super confusing because there's budget decisions being made at the state level, there's budget decisions being made at the federal level, there's budget decisions being made at the local level. And oftentimes these decisions connect to each other, but they're also following distinct processes. So today I'm going to focus on the state budget process, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to emphasize that one of the things we're really excited about in work happening in North Carolina is the federal funding that's coming in, presenting opportunities to advance our priorities in community. The local process being a great way for people to get really quickly engaged in the budget process. So while I'm going to talk about the state, I did want to also mention that in the case of education, state funding is critical, and that's another reason to focus on state funding in this conversation, because state funding is the majority of the dollars that go to our instructional expenses. That means it funds the teachers, the classroom supplies, the classroom personnel, the bus drivers. It does a lot of that work. Yes, there are federal dollars coming in and local dollars, but state funding is really critical. And it's critical because without it, local communities would be limited by what they could fund in their public schools because of the resources they may or may not have in their community. And one of our goals is really to think about the state budget as an equalizer, as an equity enhancing tool, a way to make sure that no community is left behind in providing the education that every child deserves. So I talked about the why, but just to emphasize, these are really important areas of decision making when we think about education because they are our tax dollars. They are able to provide resources to every community, regardless of the wealth of the community. And they also connect communities across communities to each other, and they allow us to deliver and set up a set of shared goals we have for what we want to be as a state. When we make choices about where we put the money that we have, North Carolina really, we think, needs to be guided by some core principles. These principles are about making sure that we're advancing the common good and rejecting policies that seek to divide communities. We see this a lot where one program that serves a certain community is pitted against another. And one of the things that's so important about our budget is to continue to push for policymakers to think about the abundance we have in the state, the wealth we have in the state, and that we do have the capacity to serve every community. We also think that, North Carolina can afford to build a stronger foundation of opportunity across communities. especially if we demand corporations and the wealthy pay what they owe. So right now, North Carolina is on a path to zero income taxes for corporations, for highly profitable corporations. And if we asked them to pay, we'd have $2 billion more to fund many of the priorities we have for education. So that's a little bit about why the budget matters. I don't know if there's any questions. I can pause here and see if there's any reactions to this, any ways that you've seen state budget show up in your conversations about the issues.
Xavier shared kind of his reaction to the zero income taxes for corporations. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So legislators a few years back passed a plan in state law that after 2030, corporations, highly profitable corporations, will pay zero income tax on their profits. Each year until then, the rate goes down, and the idea that of this is who benefits from this plan is very large corporations operating oftentimes in multiple states. Our analysis shows that the vast majority of the tax cut from this corporate income tax break will actually flow out of the state and will flow to corporations that have more than $20 million in profits. So I think it's really important to say, like, the corporate income tax elimination is not about a tax break for most businesses in North Carolina. Most businesses will not benefit from the corporate income tax elimination just by virtue of how they're organized. Javier, did I answer that, or do you want to go deeper? Yeah.
Yeah, you answered it. I was just curious what the makeup of the General Assembly was at the time when they initially passed this. Because I moved to North Carolina back in 2017, and I'm just curious, like, was this a bipartisan effort, or was the General Assembly like what we see it as today?
It was not a bipartisan effort. It wasn't a solely Republican, like the vote wasn't solid Republican. There were a few Democrats who voted in support. I can get you the actual vote on the final budget, but it was the leadership of the Republican caucus in the Senate and House who advanced this idea and pushed it forward. So very similar composition in terms of where we are today. At that time, there was a strong supermajority too.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Alexandra, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Great. Is there anything else in the chat? Okay.
No. Great. If you can't see the chat, Alexandra, just know our fellows love to engage with content.
Oh, good. No, that's great.
Creative.
I only have one screen, so I can't see see everything, but
no worries.
That's really exciting. I hope that you'll keep sharing your reactions and ideas and connections.
To give you a little insight, someone said, how do I get the General Assembly to recognize me as a corporation?
Right. I mean, I think that's a fair point. And one of the things that we've been saying, like, one of the problems with our tax code right now is that it asks people to pay more than profitable corporations. And it asks people with middle and low incomes to pay the most as a share of their income, way more than millionaires. And I can share that. I don't have that data, I think, in this slide, but I will send it along so you can take a look at it, and would love to come back and take a deeper dive on tax policy, because it is a huge aspect of how we make budget decisions. One of the strategies of bringing our income tax to zero is giving these breaks to wealthy people and profitable corporations, but it's also about shrinking the dollars that we have to invest in community. And so if we want to see a good budget, an equitable budget, we have to be fighting on tax policy too. So I'll keep going through the presentation, but try to pause. I think we have chance for some small breakout discussions. I wanted to break down the state budget process and give you all some ways to think about the timeline, the roles, and how this process moves in North Carolina so that you can be thinking about how your issues could be brought forward to legislators. So as I said, when we think about the choices in the budget, we think about how much taxes are collected and who pays those taxes. We think about how dollars are divided across priorities. So how much money should go to education? How much money should go to health and human services? And then where is spending targeted into which communities? Who's getting the benefits of state funding? Is that narrowly focused to special interests, or is it advanced in a way that is equitable, giving more money to the communities that need it most to get access to opportunity? Those are the kinds of choices that we think about in the state budget process. So the budget process at the state level is usually thought of as they call it a biennial budget process, but it's basically the idea is that we write a budget for 2 years. And that's a good idea because for 2 years, you can project out a little bit more and have continuity of what you want to fund over time. The challenge is that while we have a budget put together a full budget every 2 years, it is still the case that legislators come back and consider revisions to the budget every year. So how this works typically is that in an odd year, so 2023, or looking forward, 2025 will be considered a long session. This will be the time when legislators will come together to establish the biennial budget for the next 2 years. And then in the even year, 2026, it's called a short session, and that's when they'll consider revisions to second year of the budget. So some of the work right now that's exciting is to think about as we head into January 2025, how are we putting in front of policymakers the priorities that should be in the next 2-year budget? So just about the roles and the decision makers, and this is sort of in a generic sense. And then I'll talk about the actuality of it. The governor proposes a budget every year. Often times this budget is the first budget proposal that we see. And the governor has the ability to veto a budget. So the governor can decide that the budget isn't responsible, doesn't meet the needs, doesn't, for whatever reason, decide to veto it. And then it follows the same legislative process as a typical bill. The budget, though, that the governor puts forward is oftentimes just a document that serves as a kind of guidepost. It gets introduced as a piece of legislation, but the work the legislature does is really on their own budget proposals. The House and Senate usually pass their own budget proposals, and they have to agree on that budget as part of the final step. But the decision makers oftentimes are appropriation committee chairs. These are committee chairs in both the House and Senate. They are often considered the lead budget writers, and they work, however, under the limitations that, in this case, Speaker Moore and Senate President Berger put in place. So the Senate and House leaders decide on a spending target. They say you only have this much money to spend, and then the budget writers from the Appropriation Committee write the budget to that. And we'll talk more about the challenges with that approach in a minute. So here are some of the steps, and they give you a little bit of a sense of sort of the timeline, and hopefully a view into like where your engagement can have maximum impact. And I always use this slide to just say the earlier you can be having conversations about budget, the better. Because as agencies are putting forward their requests to the governor, they're setting priorities for the budget debate in the coming year. And that happens in the fall. So oftentimes by the time we see a budget in April or May, it's already been fully baked into the decision-making process. And so fall is when you start to see agencies put together their numbers, come up with ideas for programming that they want to expand. Usually in a long session, the governor prepares and releases a budget proposal in February. Sometimes it's March. It really depends on how challenging the economic context is and so on. And then each chamber of the legislature will create their budget after that. Usually this process starts in March, but it really doesn't get underway until after April. And the reason for that is that they use the April tax deadline as a data point for how much revenue they'll actually have. So most of what they're trying to get to is an understanding of what are the dollars that are available, and then release the budget close after April. Once each legislative chamber approves a version of a budget, they appoint a conference committee. I've very rarely seen it that both House and Senate agree and write the exact same budget down to the period, comma, everything has to be exactly the same for it not to require a conference committee. So that committee is the one that comes together to make sure that they agree as a legislature on a final version that they then deliver to the governor. And usually this does not happen by the end of June, but happens in the July-August timeline. And once it goes to the governor, that's when the governor has the opportunity to decide whether to sign, veto, or allow the budget to become law without signature. And so recently that just actually happened. The governor decided, because of the terrible voucher provisions, because of a lot of the really policy provisions within the budget that were sort of stuffed in there, that he would not sign the budget, but he wouldn't veto it because Medicaid expansion was provided in that budget. So oftentimes we see in this process a lot of really challenging dynamics where issues are pushed against each other. And the outcome is a budget that allocates our public money. And you'll see this often, a sort of a pie chart of like how the dollars are broken up. You know, one of the things I always point out in this graph is that there's no slice of the pie that's for waste, fraud, and abuse. And yet we often hear that like, oh, public money is being spent on wasteful things. And while certainly we should be careful to make sure our public dollars are not going to wasteful things, the reality is a lot of our public money is going to critical things that make people's lives better. It's going to K through 12 education. It's going to healthcare. It's going to safety net programs that make sure people have food, housing, childcare, income supports. And it's keeping our environment safe and healthy. So this is the final outcome, a budget that sort of divides up the dollars. And oftentimes, you know, within those details is where we like to spend time working directly with groups on like where has their priority gone, ended up in the budget process, and what does that look like over time. So I think this is where we were gonna break out maybe into small group discussions, just because that was a lot of content I know about the budget process, and talk a little bit in smaller groups about what stands out to you about the budget process and how do you see the budget process right now in North Carolina impacting education?
And I'm creating breakout rooms. Can someone drop the questions in the chat? And how much time do you want to give, Alexandra?
How are we doing on time? Let me look at my phone. Maybe 10, is 10 minutes too little?
I think that's a really good time.
Okay, okay, good.
All right, so I think these are good. I'm gonna open rooms and the instructions are in the chat. Make sure you pick a note taker.
Was she also supposed to go into a room?
Maybe oh, because she's not a co-host, right?
I
Uh,
made her.
Oh, then maybe she's going in to listen.
Oh, yeah. Mira, you're so funny.
Why?
Earlier, when she was asking you about the chat and you explained some of the things you were saying, I couldn't help but laugh, and then she like took it seriously.
I
And
love
I was
it.
just
I appreciated that because I got the same question.
honestly, yeah. Well, can we all be
It was
corporations?
like, that is kind of funny, but the reality is, let me jump into a room to listen in.
Okay.
Ricardo and Oscar, let us know if y'all have issues getting into your breakout rooms.
I remember Oscar being on his phone. Well, both of them are on their phones, actually.
Yeah,
Did you hear this room?
struggle. Say that
I
one time.
didn't. I saw a response to the Google Voice.
Yeah, that was Yasmin, right?
Let's see.
She said she was out traveling.
Still?
She's in Chicago. Well, she's in Chicago for work, and the time difference messed her up. She thought that she would be able to get back to her room, but they're not done yet. So
Gotcha. Okay. I've got nothing from Javier or Nancy.
oh my God.
Mhm.
Wait, did you put Luisa onto this?
Onto what?
She just made a whole graphic.
Oh, she told me she wanted to make an Olympics thing. I'm like, oh my gosh,
Oh
absolutely.
my God, Luisa. She's so quick.
Where is it? Where is it?
She just dropped it out there.
Wow.
That's so good. We got to share that. Let me put it in the slideshow so we can.
Yes.
That's too funny.
Like, where does she even get the headshots?
Right? She's
Yeah.
quick.
Dang.
Aw.
Did Isak already post the
Just literally thinking that, Brian. I'm like, not
Yeah.
Russian. And I'm about to post it on his behalf.
Okay. Oh, he did not. Okay, yeah. Interesting. Okay, I thought that he did because Axel was texting me about Luisa. Like, oh, what's her background? Does she want to work with us? And I'm like, dang, Isak's post must have gotten out there quick.
Also, I'm like, why does I feel like Axel stays trying to take our people?
I know. Oh my gosh. Here's some, I mean, yes,
Oh.
it's been, but we have our folks here. So
Students are back in the classroom. And they make it really difficult for classrooms, for teachers, for educators and public education systems to plan for the school year ahead. I talked about this graph, but just really emphasizing that North Carolina is holding down spending to levels well below where we've been historically. And I think the thing about this graph that's really helpful for conversations with policymakers and with the public is that oftentimes there's an argument that spending's been way out of control and we need to cut spending to keep it in control. This graph just shows you that it's not, there are times when spending has been a little bit above 5%, but it's never been that far off of that average. And the reason for that is that the spending is holding a foundation for the growing population. And what we've seen in recent years is that the state is not keeping up with the size of our economy, with the size of the number of people that they have to serve with public programs and services. And the impacts are real. Like we've seen them in the headlines. You know, bus drivers aren't being hired. Vacancy rates are very high across the education systems. In the small group I was in, we talked about the childcare cliff that happened and the lack of funding, full funding from the state to make sure that childcare providers could stay open. State budget decisions are impacting every aspect of people's education in North Carolina. And so it's a critical area for engaging and moving a conversation about what we actually need. And that leads into the Leandro case. You know, I think the Leandro case, in my view, is a minimum. It's a minimum standard of education, and we're not even meeting that minimum. And we know in the case of Leandro, what it's been costed out, what it would require to fully fund the Leandro plan. That's $6.9 billion. The scheduled tax cuts that I talked about before for corporations and wealthy people costs $13.4 billion a year. So we could stop those and we could fully fund the Leandro plan with those dollars. And we would arguably not only get better outcomes for children and be able to more adequately pay educators and school professionals, but we would also get the long-term economic benefits that a good, solid education can provide. So we know that the budget is going to be a big part of the work that is needed in the coming 10 years, 5 years. And that the sooner we can continue to find ways to work together, I think, around at the intersection of the state budget and education policy. We're really excited to work with you all to hear what your priorities are and understand how we can get analysis to you that you can use in your conversations. So there are a few things that we put here as like conversation starters with your networks, just ways to start talking about this information. I'm happy to follow up with some of the great questions that you all raised and requests for information and get that to you so that we can continue to partner as we try and make the case for the equitable budgets North Carolina communities deserve. Thank you.
Wow, look at us. We have a few minutes for any questions. And I think there was one. Oh, okay. I was gonna uplift your comment here. So do you want to jump on?
Yeah, I was wondering when you said that there wasn't a budget passed, does that mean no money was sent out, or do they just reuse the budget from the previous 2-year cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. They passed in 2014, I think it was, what is basically a rule that if by July 1 they don't have a state budget, they have to hold spending at the prior year spending level. So they are able to fund programs, but two things about that. They only can fund what was an existing commitment. So no new programs, no new allocations to different services, and no increases to keep up with the cost of delivering services. So as you all know, we just experienced a very high inflation period. where the costs of everything went up exponentially. And funding in those years did not keep up because we weren't passing budgets that adjusted for the higher costs that everything from food to the inputs to build roads, for example, cost.
Any other questions y'all wanna?
I have a quick question. I might have missed this earlier because I joined in a little bit later, but is there an opportunity for like, I know they do this at the lower level for like more like county budgets and things like that, but at the state level, is there a time where they take public opinions of it or anything like that? And I do apologize once again if you already mentioned that.
No, it's a great question. I think I skipped over it probably a little bit. The reality is that there is very little opportunity for public input at the state level right now. That is not how it's always been. In the past, there used to be public input sessions, public hearings. In committee, the appropriations committee would open up and you could testify. That is very rare right now. We very rarely see opportunities. When we do see them, it's often in the moment, like the committee chair will say, does anybody here have a public comment? And of course, nobody knew that they were going to ask that. So nobody was in the room, nor could they get there because they're often during the day when people are working. So it's a huge part of the process that we're working to improve is making sure that there are more opportunities for public input during the process. And there's more opportunity for public input at the front end too, to make sure that before they even set a number for what they're going to spend, they're actually listening to community and understanding what are the needs, what are the priorities. So that's a great question. Sorry, I skipped over a little bit of that.
No, thank you so much for clarifying. That's what I figured, because I feel like the higher up, the less they want to be accountable to. So you just clarified exactly what I was thinking. So I appreciate that.
In one of the small group notes, someone, and I was in this group, they were just wondering like, who makes up these committees and do they have people that have like knowledge about what is needed? Do they have backgrounds in education or in healthcare so that budgets can be informed by people that have expertise in those areas? Can you chat about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's also a great question. And we talked about this a little bit in the small group. But just to be explicit, it's not a requirement that a legislator has a background in the issue area where they get appointed to the committee. So it's possible that that happens. And in some instances, I can think of a few legislators who have been educators and sit on the appropriations committee, for example. And I think one of the things that's challenging about that is then the legislators don't have context because they're not taking public comment. They're often not engaging external expertise besides the agencies. And even then it's somewhat limited in how much they seek out like the education, Department of Public Instruction's views and whether the Department of Public Instruction reflects the views of teachers, and school cafeteria workers and bus drivers, is a question. So I think it's a huge issue that we have. And really part of the reason why the process has to reflect more, has to create more opportunities for public input and for more transparency about what's being thought about. If we saw the budget more than 48 hours before it was passed, a bunch of education folks like you all could look at it and say, no, this doesn't reflect what we need. And then legislators could be ready to debate the bill. But what we get now is a budget within 48 hours that we can't, that isn't shared publicly, and experts aren't able to sort of weigh in and say, I don't see, what we need in this education program that's shown this kind of benefit for communities. So it's a big gap.
All right. Well, we'll definitely share your contact info and you have it on here.
Yeah.
But just to let people know, there's a lot of great resources that BTC has on their website. And it sounds like Alexandra will also share other graphs that will help us think about our role in being involved in the budget process, or how we can continue to analyze where is money going so that we know how to advocate for the needs or the gaps we see.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all, for all the thank yous in the chat. Look at y'all. Well, right now we are going to have a little time to take a break. Through this presentation, there is a survey specifically for BTC that helps them start getting more community input on the needs that they should be really thinking about across the state. So after that break, we will take some time to fill that survey out and continue to support their work as they think about the right priorities, or the priorities that are being uplifted across North Carolina. But we're gonna have a break. We are gonna have a little optional dance break at 7:35. So stretch, go get some water. We're gonna do a little bit of a dance video together.